difference, one cup at a time. Yeah, this is tea time. Yeah, making a difference, one cup at a time. Tea time. So be sure to grab your tea, grab a seat, and tune in to Miss Liz. Tea time, making a difference, one cup at a time. Tea time, yeah. Tea time, time.
Well, welcome. It is nighttime tea. That's right. We made it through the day. We got our morning, we got our afternoon. Now we're here for the evening tea time. And I have another incredible guest joining me from Canada. That's right. We're back in Canada. This morning, Cameroon, this afternoon, United States, and now tonight we're in Canada. And I've been talking with this incredible guest in the back studio, and I think we're going to have an exciting tea. We're going to just spill some really strong tea on education, on medieval. I can't even talk. My tongue is just a twisting. So we're going to get the disclaimer in, we're going to get a little bit of the bio, and then we're going to just bring in the incredible Danièle Cybulskie. I hope I'm saying it right. I'll get her to say it right if I'm saying it wrong. And then we're going to spill some TEA, and we're going to wrap up another beautiful Thursday. Disclaimer for Miss Liz's Tea Time live shows. Miss Liz is going live using StreamYard. Before leaving a comment, please grant StreamYard permission to see your name at StreamYard.com. Please be advised that the content brought forward for any Tea Time hosted by myself, Miss Liz, is always brought forward in good faith. However, it may bring forward dialogue and opinions that are not representative of my platform. The facts and information are perceived to be accurate at this given time of airing. All Tea Time guests and audience participants are responsible for using their good judgment in taking any action that may relate to the discussion. The content brought forward may include discussion for some where they may be emotionally at risk. It is significant to know that this show is engaging in discussion forums only to offer and inspire awareness and connection and is not providing therapeutical advice. If you have any questions about this disclaimer or the panelist discussion, you may freely contact me, Miss Liz, through my email at bookingmissliz@gmail.com. Moving forward, should you choose to voluntarily participate in tonight's show in any aspect, I myself, Miss Liz, welcomes you, and should you decide that the show is not made for you at this time, I respect that, and I'll see you at a later date and a later show at a later time on a Thursday, because tea time is Thursdays. Unless we have a fill-in or a rescheduled tea time, because life does happen, right? So now let me give you a little bit on my incredible guest that's sitting in the studio waiting to come and spill some really good, strong tea. So Danièle has been making Middle Ages fun, entertaining, and accessible for over a decade. She is the author of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, Life in Medieval Europe, Facts and Fiction, and the 5-minute Medieval List, which debuted at the top of Amazon's Canadian charts through her feature articles at medieval.net, as well as those she's written for several international magazines. Danièle has reached over 1 million readers worldwide. To find out more about Danièle, please check out Miss Liz's Facebook page. Her full bio is there, so you got some goodies there. And if you're checking out the audio on the podcast stations, check in the description because that will all be there. So now let me get my guest into the studio and let's spill some tea while I grab a sip of tea. So welcome, Danielle.
Hello, Miss Liz. Thank you for having me on.
It is an honor to have you here. So I want you to spill some tea, spill the goodies. Who is Danielle, and how did Danielle get into the medieval? I can't even say it.
I know it takes some practice, right? Medieval, yeah. And you are asking how to pronounce my last name. Everyone stumbles over it, so don't worry about it. It's Cybulskie. Um,
Cybulskie.
And I just want to apologize to the people who are listening just to the audio. I have a really bad cold today, so I'm going to try not to cough too much in your ears, but please bear with me today. It's winter, right?
It's that winter cold, right? That spring before the winter cold before spring comes.
Yes, I'm hoping spring's going to come really soon. So you were asking how I got into the Middle Ages, the medieval period, and the short answer that I tell people is the truth, which is Disney. I really loved watching Sleeping Beauty was my favorite movie, and second to that was the Robin Hood movie by Disney, which has that fox in it, right? That everybody loves. And I just loved looking at that aesthetic. I loved the stories. And as I grew up, I was always really interested in Arthurian stories, Robin Hood stories. But it wasn't until I got to university that I realized you can make a career out of it, that people study this stuff, literature, this medieval literature for a living. And I was hooked on that. So after taking a course on medieval romance, which is the Arthurian stories, when people talk about medieval romance, it's not all kissing stories, it's actually stories that were written that weren't in Latin. I took a course on that, and that was it for me. I ended up studying the Middle Ages after that.
Oh, I didn't even know they had courses. I
Yeah.
know Disney, but I didn't know about the courses, right?
Yeah, it's fun stuff.
So Danielle, I want to get into like you've written a lot and it's been in magazines worldwide and your book
Mhm.
and all of that. So what got you into writing? Like when did you start? What age and all that good stuff?
I started after I finished graduate school. So I did an undergraduate degree. And then after that, I decided I wanted to be a medievalist. So I did a victory lap and then I did a master's degree in literature. But that was because I thought I would get a job teaching English or something. But almost all my courses were cross listed with the Center for Medieval Studies. So history was what I was doing a lot of, as well as literature. And so after that, I was in my late 20s. I was home with my first baby and I was just really bored. I was missing that time that I had spent in university talking to people about this stuff. And there were shows on, I think The Tudors was on at that time, and people were watching that and they had questions about what life was like before that time. So The Tudors is a little bit after the period that I study, but not much. And so I had all of this knowledge I want to share with people. And so I started writing a blog called The 5 Minute Medievalist. And that was just to take 5 minutes to help people become medievalists like me. And they could learn about things like the fact people didn't think the earth was flat, the fact that many torture devices are actually fakes from the Victorian period, that kind of stuff I found interesting and wanted to share with people. And then after a few years, my writing was picked up by a bigger website, which you're showing right now, called medievalist.net. And then they started to commission articles from me. I started to write there for a few years, and then I compiled a bunch of articles into a book to just see how that would go. And I called it The 5 Minute Medievalist. And that debuted, as you said at the beginning, at the top of Canada's charts for history. And so that was when I think I was like, okay, maybe I'm an author. And at that point, I started to write, and two books came after that, as well as a tiny book called The 5 Minute Medievalist Guide to Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse. But my bigger books are the ones that you mentioned, which were Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, and the new one, which is How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life.
So are those the books that are used in the history classes in the schools? Like how does it get into the schools?
Yeah. So, first of all, I didn't realize people were using my work in schools because they don't necessarily reach out to an author when they use it, right? So, people were starting to use the articles that I'd written for medievalist.net
Oh,
in schools, in university and college. And one time there was a school Fitchburg State University, where the professor reached out to me and said, I want to have a competition with my students to see who could write like you, who can write accessible medieval history for the public. And so I got to judge a student competition on people writing medieval history for the public. So that was probably the first time I realized it was really getting used. I don't know how extensively life in medieval Europe has been used in classrooms, but then I was asked to help OntarioLearn create a course that could be used in many different colleges at the same time. It was an early online course. So it doesn't seem that long ago, but in 2015, there weren't a lot of courses that were just solely online. So around that time, I was commissioned to help be the subject matter expert for a course that we called the Middle Ages Fact and Fiction. I think it was, yeah, Middle Ages Fact and Fiction, and it's still being taught, although not by me, at colleges around Ontario. I was teaching it for a while, but I'm no longer teaching that one.
So for anybody that's listening and that will listen to the replay later, Danielle, what is Ontario Learn?
That's a good question. So OntarioLearn is a platform on which a whole bunch of different colleges can make it so that their students can take an online course that's not otherwise um, being offered at their college, right? So if you're studying at Cambrian College in Sudbury, for example, you may not have a medievalist on staff. There aren't that many medievalists floating around in Northern Ontario, perhaps. And so as a student, you could take this online course and get an elective credit in medieval history, and it was really fun course. It's still being offered. It's still a fun course where we have the students watch A Knight's Tale and Robin Hood and things like that, and they get to understand some of the myths that are propagated around the Middle Ages, and they get to understand why it matters, why this history matters. So OntarioLearn is a platform that facilitates online learning for all sorts of
Okay.
colleges across Ontario.
So it's online learning.
Yes.
Yeah, because I haven't heard of it, and I was like, "What is that?" I said, "I'm gonna pick Danielle's brain when she gets here." Like, what? What
Yeah,
is that, right?
yeah, it's exclusively for Ontario college students, so other people can't take it, but
Okay.
the college students are able to take courses that way.
So only in Ontario they can use this. So
My
it's not
course
like
is my
anywhere in Canada, right? Just Ontario.
my course is only available in Ontario, yeah. But again, I'm not the one who's offering that anymore, like, I'm not teaching it, but it is the one that I constructed, unless they've updated it in the last 8 years.
So you've been in many magazines. So what kind of magazines have you been featured in?
I've been featured mostly in ones that are specialized. So, Medieval Warfare magazine and the Medieval magazine mostly. Those 2 magazines are edited by people that I met through medievalist.net. So it was an easy way for me to write for them. And then I actually co-edited one volume of Ancient History magazine, which is kind of fun, and I've written for them as well. And then I was featured at this past year in BBC History magazine
Oh,
because I was on their podcast talking about my monk book. So I didn't write for BBC History, but my interview about that book is featured on a new section of that magazine that features podcast episodes. So yeah, I have been in BBC History, but I didn't write for them.
so the book that you're talking about is I'm looking here. The monk, the monk, the monk.
Yeah, so
To,
that's
to
how to
live
live.
like a monk. So did you
Right.
do research like on a bunch of monks, or like how did you go about that one?
Of course you have to do research, right? So this book was actually pitched to me. So I was very lucky in that because I'd written so much, I've written over 200 articles for Medievalist.net, so a lot. And
Oh,
so that publisher, Abbeville Press, came to me and the editor said, I have this idea about talking about monks, medieval monks, and how a lot of the ways that they lived could be applicable to allowing us to live a healthy lifestyle now. Would you like to be the one who makes this come to life? And so I thought, this is great because I didn't know enough about monks at the time. And I wanted to learn more about them because they're work was fundamental in allowing us to actually understand the medieval period. They were the people who did the chronicling, right? So they told us what was happening. They were the people that copied the books. So they are the reason that we have the books that we have now,
Oh,
not only medieval books, but ancient books, which they copied. So monks were really important to the Middle Ages. So I wanted to learn more about them. And then when I'm not working on history, when I'm reading outside of history, I like to read books about wellness and positive psychology and how to make ourselves live in a way that is healthy, that is mentally healthy, that's physically healthy. So this was a great project for me because it brought together a bunch of interests that I had. So they pitched this idea to me, and I turned it into a book.
yeah. And I just learned something new. Like, I didn't know that the monks were the ones that did all the writing.
Hmm. Yeah, so the monks were the ones who were educated, and they were the ones who were educating other people for the most part, people within the church. The church was the educators of society at the time. And this is important to remember because a lot of people have this idea that the church was anti science, when really they were the keepers of knowledge. And they were really interested in science because they wanted to better understand God. So they were the people who were reading Aristotle. They were the people who were reading Islamic texts about math. They were the people who were copying this stuff out and sending it to other monasteries so that, other monks could study this stuff. So they were the ones that were writing these books and copying these books. And then again, they were also historians, right? So they were the ones who were saying, in this year, the king died, and then we had this new king, or they were the ones who were doing that writing. So we owe them a lot when it comes to understanding what happened during the years 500 to 1500. So yeah, they were integral to that and really uh, invested in education and science and learning. So yeah, they were super, super important to the period.
So we have a question here for you from Twitter.
Mhm.
Want to know what year were your books based on?
Okay, that's a good question. So, my specialty is the 14th century. So, for people who don't remember their centuries, which is fair, that's the 1300s. And that is the time during which you have the Black Death, you have the Hundred Years' War, you have famines, you have all sorts of tragedies and amazing things happening. So that is the time that I study the most. But I try to make the books that I write as general as possible so that people can get a sense of the period. That said, it is a 1,000-year period, and I only look at Europe, and I mostly look at England and France. So when we talk about this 1,000-year period, there is so much that needs to be learned and understood, and you cannot get that across in one book. So the books I write about tend to be the high and later Middle Ages, so about 1,200 to about 1,500. That's usually where my focus is, and that is what people think of when they think of knights and castles and that stuff. I don't tend to do the early Middle Ages, which is Vikings, for people who are kind of putting signposts along history. I don't tend to look at Vikings. When I talk about monks, that book, it starts with the Benedictine rule, which was written down in, I think it's the 6th century. I have a cold, so I'm I'm trying to remember my dates here. The 6th century by Saint Benedict. But much of the monastic culture as we understand it today was really solidified in the 12th century, so the 1100s. So if we're talking about the monk book, much of the stuff I'm looking at there is around the 1100s. And then monastic life didn't really change all that much over time because it was meant to be a certain way. It was meant to follow the rule of Saint Benedict. So it was meant to really stay the same for many hundred years.
So we have another question here for you, Danielle. Do you know what the oldest age of the oldest monk?
Like, what? How old did they live to, or who was the first monk?
Yeah, I think they're asking who the first monk is here.
Mm, okay. Well, I don't know that we can pinpoint it was this guy, but monasticism basically started for Christians with the Desert Fathers. This is the tradition of around how monasticism started. So basically, the Desert Fathers were people who wanted to be hermits. So they wanted to live a life where they were just living in austerity and poverty, just thinking about God all the time. So they'd go away from society and they think about God. And a lot of people wanted to be hermits because this is the ultimate way you can serve God, right? All you're doing is concentrating on worshiping him. But it's really hard to do that without sinning. Like, it's really hard. So basically, in a nutshell, a lot of people who wanted to be hermits but didn't feel like they could do it themselves by themselves joined together and went as communities out as far away from society as they could and started to live together in a way that resembled hermits, but as a community. So they're basically a community of hermits that are trying to live without sin. And it's easier, I think, as we know, I've said in the book too, when we have goals to have cheerleaders and other people on our side helping us get there. And that's
Yeah.
basically the seed of monasticism is people working together to help them reach their spiritual goals. But I don't think we can say, Brother Fred was the first one. That's just kind of lost to the sands of time.
Right. So, from the way that you're explaining this, Danielle, that's where the monasteries came in, right? Where they
Mhm.
built these places where it was only men, right, that were monks.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point actually. Monks are men.
Okay.
And but it's a good question because monks are different from friars. So they live in a similar way in that they take vows of usually poverty, chastity, and obedience. But monks must live, or they're meant to live, away from society in an enclosed community. So you go there, you don't leave unless you have a mission from your abbot, like you're going to do some work in the hospital, or we need you to sell some chickens at market. You're supposed to live in the monastery at all times. Friars are the ones that go out and preach. So when you talk about Friar Tuck, for example, in the Robin Hood legend, he doesn't live in a monastery all the time. He might be traveling around and preaching. So when you think about Franciscans or Dominicans, the ones who go around and beg for their food, the preachers, those are friars, not monks. And then we have nuns. Nuns usually follow the same rules as monks, but they lived in their own communities. And the only real difference was that nuns could not actually perform mass. They couldn't be priests according to tradition. So you
Okay.
still had to have a priest come in and perform mass. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated and I think exciting because sometimes you'd have double monasteries. So basically, you'd have a wall, and on one side, you'd have the monks area. On the other side, you'd have the nuns area. So they could actually live together but apart. And many of these ones, like there's an abbey called Fontevraud, and they were run by abbesses, by women. So you could sometimes have them together, but still separate. And sometimes, in fact, often, it would be run by an abbess instead of an abbot. So I think that's interesting. So the question of
Yeah.
like, what is a monk is the first question I answer in the book because it is more complicated than you might think, right?
And I always wondered if it was always just men, like,
Yeah.
because if you don't know about it, you just assume, okay, men and women are monks. But it's a good points that you're making, that the monks were men and the nuns, you know. So there's a lot of history being taught here tonight. So anybody that loves history, jump on and let's hear your comments, let's hear your questions and all of that. Uh, I think the person that was asking the question might be bilingual because of the way that they asked the question.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
hope we gave them the answer that they were looking for, and that. Um, so I want to get into, we talked about the elementary school, the colleges and that. So you have also been in the elementary schools and secondary schools as well, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So I have done a little bit of traveling with a group called Blackthorn, which works out of Guelph. So I did a little bit of work with them and we visited schools, but also my book about the zombie apocalypse has been used a couple of times in elementary schools to talk about, well, not only the Middle Ages, because that's the point of the book, is to really just be kind of a fun way to talk about the Middle Ages and technology, but also as a way of helping kids think about things like how you would build a society, what's necessary to it. So the zombie book is really what has been um, most useful to elementary schools. But I've also done a couple of talks because in Ontario, the kids learn about the Middle Ages in grade 5, I think. And so I would go into a couple of grade 5 classrooms and tell them about the Middle Ages. So that's always fun because they do have really interesting questions like, do people have wolves as pets?
Oh, I would have never even thought of that.
That's what you have kids for.
But yeah, what did you have as pets back then? Because there was
Well,
no cats and dogs, was there?
oh yeah, totally. Yeah, but
Yeah.
cats and dogs would be pets, and some of them were spoiled, but many of them were working because it's another mouth to feed. So dogs and cats would have jobs. A cat's job obviously is going to be a mouser. They were really good at
Catch the
that.
mice.
Yeah. And so sometimes monks would smuggle in cats and have them as pets, even though they weren't supposed to have pets. But dogs are a really good example because they were useful as working dogs. So we know that they could be used for security. They were used to pull carts. They were even used as guide dogs. We have one manuscript image of a person who is visually impaired, who's got a cane in one hand and a dog in the other. So dogs had jobs, and those were really common pets, although there has been uh, some history that's been discovered about a nun, like a convent, where a nun had a monkey, I think, as a pet that she'd smuggled in. We know about this because sometimes a bishop would come in and check on things like, how's everything going here? And everybody would have to like turn out their cells and show all the stuff that they've been hiding. Yeah, at least one nun had a monkey as a pet, but it was usually cats and dogs.
That's that little rebel nun that wanted the monkey.
Yeah, I mean, they were always breaking the rules. Half the time, what we learn about people, or the reason we can learn about them, is because they are breaking the rules. Somebody has to write rules to say, we're not doing this anymore, which shows us that people were probably doing those things.
Yeah. So you mentioned bishop. So what
Mhm.
was the job of the bishop?
So the bishop has many jobs. The bishop is the one who's in charge of what's called the parish. So it could be several villages, it could be a town, but an area in which he was in charge of all of the churches and basically the spiritual health of that region. So he would be the one who would be appointing a priest to be the priest for that village. Sometimes a priest would be the guy who would go and visit several villages because they couldn't afford to have a priest for each one. The bishop would also be checking in on, monks and nuns and seeing how they're doing. Sometimes they would be advising people higher up in the church chain, so cardinals and popes. Sometimes they would be advising kings. So the bishops did a lot of stuff. They were very, very powerful men.
And we don't hear a lot about the bishops in the history stories, do we?
I mean, yeah, I think when most people are learning about the Middle Ages, for example, the emphasis tends to be on kings. But bishops were very important because they were the most educated men usually at court. So they were the people who could tell you, this is what these important people have said about this in the past. They had their hand on the pulse of what everybody was doing. They would judge people for sins. For example, like in some places, in most places in Europe, the king would have one law and the church would have another. So the king's justice would take care of things like theft and murder, but the bishops would be taking care of stuff like adultery, right? Or fornication, things like that. They would be the ones giving out that punishment or ruling on that. So we don't hear a lot, I think. Everyday people don't hear a lot about what the bishops were doing back then, but they were pretty lazy guys and pretty important guys.
Yeah, they did quite a bit from what you're saying.
Mhm.
So is there any books out there about bishops or any plans of you writing a book on a bishop?
No, no, actually, church history is not normally my forte. It's not usually where I spend a lot of time. But this book, the monk book, was just a perfect intersection of what I do, which is make stuff accessible, make history accessible to people who just watch stuff on TV and want to learn more stuff. I am the person who's kind of we like to talk about myself as being the gateway drug to history, right? So I might tell you something interesting, and then you might go and read a book by somebody who's studied that in depth. So I can't think of any books on just bishops um, off the top of my head, but I did do a podcast on bishops with a guy named Craig Nakashian, who's a PhD, who talks about warrior bishops. So bishops were supposed to be men of God. They weren't supposed to be, out there fighting wars, but some of them did. So I did do a podcast on that if people want to hear more about warrior bishops.
Oh, well, that's really cool. And now that since you're mentioning podcasts and that,
Mhm.
let's get into a little bit what got you into podcasting.
Yeah, okay. Well, I had this idea in the back of my mind for a little while, and it was basically the fact that I had been writing for the internet for 5 years, 5 years at this point, for medievalist.net. I'd been writing for the internet, 10 years at that point, and I realized that I had so much information that I want to share. Obviously, you can tell I'm really enthusiastic about it, but people would only find what I was doing if they went to that website on the right day or they were following me on social media. And I was like, I want to reach more people. I want more people to learn this stuff. There are so many myths about the Middle Ages that are just wrong, that make it look like a time that was brutal and dark and just violent. And so I wanted to push back against that narrative. I wanted to bring more history to more people. So I started a podcast. We started it January of 2019, medievalist.net. Again, you have the website up there. They distribute it for me. So you can find it on their website and you can find it on, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, everywhere. And what I do on the podcast is I interview experts. So again, like I'm the gateway drug. I will bring people who are experts in one thing because when you get into that level of history, you tend to really specialize, right? So I will have someone on who talks about, well, a couple of weeks ago it was just swans, just medieval swans. Had people talk about bishops, for example, warrior bishops, or just this one king, or just this one thing. And so overall, I've covered everything from Byzantium to laundry to pigs to the sex lives of people back in the day. So it's a really fun opportunity to get these experts out front and center because otherwise people might not see their books, right? They're teaching in universities and maybe you don't see their work. So that was kind of the thing I wanted to do, was to bring them forward so that more people could learn more things.
Well, and you mentioned something about the medieval times where you said people think it's dark, and you
Yeah.
said it was light. And I think there is so much misconception and misinformation out there that we just assume it was all blood and war, like it was just kill, 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 kill.
Yeah.
But they have some good stories back then.
Mhm.
Homemakers, like the women and everything, like the dances that they had back then. Like we don't do any of those dances now, like the waltz and all of those dances. So is there like a special dance that they used to do back in the day?
That's a really hard one to trace, and I'm the wrong person to ask about what they might be called, but people did dance, of course. People partied. One my favorite movie is A Knight's Tale, and not because it's accurate, because it's not accurate, it's not meant to be accurate, but it gets at the fact that people had fun. They had tournaments, and at the tournaments, they were worried about fashion, or they were worried about their team, or they were doing chanting. That is what people are like across the world, across time. It's not all mud and blood. That's just not how it was. So that's my favorite movie because of that. But could I tell you what those dances were called? Nope. I'll have to find an expert and put them on my podcast because
So have you,
yeah.
Danielle, have you ever worn like any clothing from that time? Like, have you ever dressed up to play a character when you go into the schools or?
Yeah, so I did a couple of times, but that's not really what I tend to do. That's not how I tend to approach it. I think that there's a lot to be said for that, to understand better by actually wearing the outfit or trying to cook in the way that they did back then, because you learn a whole lot that way. That's called experimental archaeology, and it can teach us a lot. It's just not my vibe, because I think there are many people who do it in a way where they're putting on a character.
Yeah,
And when I'm doing this, I'm doing it to learn and not to act.
yeah,
So, um, so it's not the place where I tend to engage with medieval studies. I want to be looking at it instead of wearing it. That said, when I do put these clothes on, it does teach me a lot about how to walk around in them, how tight the fit might be, what the material feels like, how heavy the weight is. And I think there are small things like that that will affect everything, right? So, for
yeah,
example, you might have events in history that turned on the fact that someone had a bad day, and maybe part of their bad day was like they had a stone in their shoe. Small human things like that make a big difference.
yeah.
So, there's a lot to be said for wearing this stuff. It's just not what I tend to do.
Well, and back then they had many layers too,
Hmm. Yeah.
you know, and it
Yeah.
was like pieces of quilts. So they would put like this piece on and then kind of pin, like they wore a lot of pins, right, with the material.
Yeah. So, especially in the early part of the Middle Ages, things were put together with pins and laces, and then buttons were invented. People say that buttons were invented sometime around the 12th century, and then that made for a closer fit, right? It really affected fashion because,
Yeah,
man, these people were fashionistas as well. So, yeah, you do have to think about, how can I drape this? How can I use this pin so that it's not going to fall off in public? And then what will this pin look like to other people? Is it going to be blingy enough? Is it going to show who I am? So, yeah, there's a lot that went into clothing back in the day.
and the fashion, right? I'm always amazed with the fashion. I'm just like, can you imagine how long it takes to get dressed and how long it takes to get undressed? I'm just like, that's just a whole workout right there. Like,
Well, I mean, this is a time before petticoats, right? So if you are walking through a museum, I don't know when the last time you've been to the ROM was, Miss Liz, the Royal Ontario Museum, but if you walk through history, the clothes get more uncomfortable as you get past the Middle Ages. So they weren't wearing corsets in the Middle Ages. They weren't wearing petticoats. They were wearing stuff that was drapey, that was laced, that was much more comfortable. It didn't have that boning in it, right? Like the
right?
corsets of
It's
later.
some of the
No,
clothes looks really uncomfortable. Like I can imagine why they would be so moody because some of it looks painful.
yeah, but that is after the Middle Ages. So they didn't have those issues during the period that I study.
Yeah. So we kind of as we got older into the newer ages, we kind of just put the bones in and put the put the pain in.
Yeah, those whalebone corsets and the high heels and stuff. Yeah, that's later than the period that I studied. People were wearing soft leather shoes. And in some ways, in some places like Italy, they had basically slipper socks. So this woolen hose with a leather sole on it. That looks pretty comfortable to me.
Right? We were like putting our slippers on and walking around in slippers all day. Like
Yeah.
I can do that. I'll do the heels once a year. The
Yeah.
slippers I'll do the rest
Yeah.
of the year. So you mentioned courses. So do you provide courses? Did you create courses? Like how does that work, or is that part of the Ontario Learn?
Well, this is a big question. I have taught on and off in colleges in Ontario. I'm not currently teaching anything. I also created a course, an online course called the Medieval Masterclass, in which I did a couple of courses, a couple of classes, and then I had experts. So I had an expert on clothing, I had an expert on blacksmithing, I had an expert on swordplay, basically, so that people who were writing fiction could see this stuff in 3 dimensions, because it's one thing to talk about fashion and it's another to see the colors that you could make with plant dyes. That's really exciting. And I think that when people are writing fiction, that's the stuff they need to know. So I created the Medieval Masterclass for creators, and it had its moment, and now I've closed it
Oh,
down.
and you mentioned something really important, plant dyes. I never knew anything about any of that. And I think we have worms that are biting again. We had the crawl, Kathy's crawling composters on this week Tuesday, and I think they're chewing on the wires again. So it looks like Danielle is kind of in some big old black hole right now. So we're just going to continue.
Oh no, I'm still here, but you're frozen. And I don't know which of us is actually live right now. But in case it's me, I'm still here drinking my tea. Okay, so here it looks like I'm live. So I will talk about plant eyes for a second until Miss Liz comes back. Okay, so Miss Liz was talking about plant dyes, and you can make all sorts of colors with plants basically by boiling them down and then soaking your plants in it. Hi, Miss Liz, you're back. I was talking about plant dyes while you were gone.
I
So
was
you
like, please, please be there because if both of us get kicked off or it closes, then I got to start everything all over again. I'm telling you, it has to be the rain. It has to be the rain in
I think
Canada.
so. We're both experiencing the rain. So I was just saying you can make all sorts of different colors with plant dyes. And the expert that I had, in case people want to look her up, was Katrin Kanya in Germany. So people can look her up later.
Oh, well, that's really cool. And thank you for sharing that while I guess I took like a little deep hole in the worm. I had Kathy Crawler's composters on Tuesday where she talked about worms. So I think the worms are chewing on my wires. I'm not sure. But thank you so much for continuing on. So
Hmm.
do you have any other books out there besides the medieval books? Have you written in any anthology books or has it been just those books?
Well, I mean, those have kept me busy. That and the teaching that I've done, because I only just stopped teaching. That's kept me pretty busy. I do have a forthcoming book, which I'm working on editing right now as soon as I get over this cold, which is called Chivalry and Courtesy: Medieval Manners for a Modern World. So it's going to be much like the monk book, which is going to have it has lots of pictures in it, but it's about etiquette and it's about chivalry. And the point of this book is to show people that people had manners back in the day, and what were the manners and what were your responsibilities and your the social niceties that you have. So the first chapter is all about the dinner table. What were you expected to be like at the dinner table? Because I will watch a medieval movie and I will see people behaving in the most disgusting manner. That is just not what it was like. People had tablecloths, they had napkins. They didn't eat off their knives. You weren't allowed to wipe your face on your sleeve. If you had a napkin, you were supposed to use it. You were supposed to wipe your mouth. You were not supposed to double dip. These are really familiar bits of etiquette, but people don't expect that back in the day people had such manners. And it's really, there are two reasons that we have so many myths about the Middle Ages. The first one is we always want to think of progress as like linear and it's going
Yeah.
straight up to us and we're the pinnacle, which means by definition the people before us were dumber and filthier, which is not how humanity has worked. But the other thing is that during the Reformation, when the church split into Catholic and Protestant, there was a lot of Protestant propaganda about the Middle Ages that was really anti-Catholic, right? Because before Protestantism, everybody was what we now call Catholic. So when Protestants were trying to make themselves look good, they were saying these people are superstitious. So it really was to their advantage to say that, people who practiced Catholicism in the Middle Ages were also superstitious, were also not very smart. So these are some of the reasons that we continue to think that people had no table manners, for example. And this is the work that I'm trying to do, is to try and counteract that.
So then these movies, the Thorn of the Dragon Head, or I think it's dragons, and Thorn. I'm trying to
Game
think.
of Thrones?
Yes. So is that anything close to being the truth, or is that just more misleading facts?
uh, it's both. It's tricky because they're like, it's authentic and it's authentic because it's super violent. It's very much like, so I've said that this is 100 years, I mean, sorry, 1,000 years of history.
Yep.
And if you compress it and you pick out the most dramatic incidents, you're going to have wars, you're going to have overthrow, you're going to have intrigue. And what I say to people is like, if you looked at the 20th century and you just picked out the big parts, it would look like people in the 20th century were constantly at war,
Yeah.
which we weren't during that 100 years. Most of that time was peaceful. During the 1,000 years of the medieval history, most people were not fighting all the time. There was more violence intrinsically, but not to the level that you see at in Game of Thrones, and that's because it's fiction, and that's because it's fantasy. But I really need George R. Martin to stop saying it's real, because it's not real. Not
There we
it,
go. We have it out there.
it's exaggerated, and I understand that it's for entertainment, but it is
Yeah.
exaggerated.
Yeah. Well, and that's it, right? And then a lot of people are like, "Well, no, that's the truth. That's the truth." Well, some stuff is exaggerated so that people will watch it,
Yeah, exactly.
because they want to see that violence, they want to see those fights, you know. I want to know how they served tea back then. Like, did they really serve it nice and elegant, or was it like, here's a teapot, let's have a cup of tea? Like,
This is an interesting question. So I mostly study Europe, and in Europe, there wasn't any tea yet.
oh,
It hadn't made its way over from Eastern Asia. It hadn't made its way over from China for much of the medieval period. So people weren't drinking tea. They were
oh,
drinking wine and beer. But in China, they were drinking tea, and they were drinking it out of the most elegant teaware ever. There are treaties, so texts that are like 2,000 years old that talk about the best way to drink tea and the best China tea, what we now call China, the porcelain that you should use for it. So in China, they were drinking it, from or for thousands of years in the most beautiful vessels. In Europe, they were not yet. They weren't drinking tea and they weren't drinking coffee quite yet, not until the early modern period, so close to Shakespeare's day.
oh, well, that's interesting to know. I
Yeah.
always wondered, like, how old is tea actually? Like,
It's
I'm doing a
very
lot of
old.
tea research, and I'm getting so many mixed messages and misconceptions. Again,
Yeah.
this country started it first, that country started it first. It's like, where's the truth? Like, give me the truth.
I will tell you the truth in that it wasn't in Europe. Eh, if it was like a couple of people who had traveled to China and brought it back with them. It was really a culture of tea in China, but not in Europe during the time that I'm studying.
Oh, and that makes a lot of sense. Uh,
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
comes from China. The leaves come from China. There's a lot of things that come from China, and we're
yeah.
talking about tea right now. So let's get into what is your tea tonight, Danielle.
Well, Miss Liz, tell me what your T is because when you said it, I thought, yeah, that sounds like me too. What does your T stand for?
So my T stands for teaching educational awareness.
Yeah. Teaching is what I do, education is what I do, awareness is what I do. So that really speaks to me because um so sometimes I do interviews where people say like, how did you get into writing? I never think of myself as a writer. And as I said to you, like I didn't for a very long time. I think of myself as a teacher. And that is because it's compulsive. I need to share this stuff. I can't help it. I'm like an uncorked genie bottle. I need to share this stuff. And so teaching, education, awareness, that's all the stuff that I'm doing. And I hope to do it in a way that reminds people that we are, as human beings, so similar across the world and across time. And that is an awareness that I'm always hoping to bring to people when I talk about history. So, yeah, I would say your tea is also my tea.
But we serve it in a different way because, like, you bring the history to the table, you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
or I bring a different flow of tea. And it's
Mhm.
okay because that's like somebody going out and buying Red Rose or Tetley, but you drink it differently. Everyone serves it differently. And
Mhm.
that's what tea is. We serve it in our own flavors and blends. So it's
Mhm.
okay to have the same and say, you know what, I'm like you know? But I add a little bit of cinnamon, or I add a little bit of butter. Like, there's so many different ways of drinking tea, right?
Mhm.
And it is you, Danielle, because you do teach and you bring the education, and the awareness is really important to you. And
Yeah.
that's what it is for me too. Is I without awareness, how do we change anything?
Yeah.
How do we change history if we're not aware of the history, the real
Exactly.
facts, right?
Mhm, and sometimes we don't know what our blind spots are. So when I'm doing my podcast or I'm doing my books, I'm never going to shame someone for not understanding. Like, when I talk about George R. R. Martin, I'm asking him not to exaggerate. That's because he knows, and he's saying that this is real. He's saying this because it works for his brand. But when I talk to someone, like you, who doesn't necessarily know off the top of her head, what is a monk? What do they do? I'm not going to shame someone for that because we don't know what we don't know. So
Right? But
this
that's
is
educating, and that's teaching people and saying it's okay to ask the question, and it's
yeah,
okay to say, I don't know what it is. Tell me what it is. Like,
yeah.
I always assumed that monks were males and nuns were females.
Mhm.
I just assumed that, and you have said that it is,
Y yeah,
and
yeah,
and that's what it is. We have to ask those questions, and it's okay to say, you know what, I don't know. We don't
yeah.
know everything. That's why we have teachers. That's why we go to school. That's why we have education, because we're not born with knowing everything in life.
That's right. And when I did my TED Talk, the first thing I started with was the flat earth myth. And I started with it because when I was in school, we learned that thing like in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he thought the earth was flat. He didn't think the earth was flat. Nobody thought the earth was flat, but that is what we were taught in school.
Yeah.
So that's not our fault that we didn't know that. That's what we were taught. So now that we understand that people didn't think the earth was flat, where do we go from here? So yeah, you and I are on the same page here.
Yeah. Well, and we need that, right? We need to have that. Okay, this is what we were taught in school. But you know what? Sometimes the teachers don't always have the right answers either because that's what they were taught. So
Mhm.
it's just a repeat of cycle and generation of, okay, this is what I was taught. So this is what I'm going to teach. And then the next teacher, until you have that one teacher that says, whoa, 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 let me do some research and let me really see if that's the truth.
That's
You
right.
know, you have
Yeah.
that one rebel, like that one nun that had the monkey, right? You have that, that
That's
little
right.
troublemaker that's like, nope, I want the monkey. I don't want the cat. I don't want the dog. I want a monkey. So,
Mhm.
and
Exactly.
that's who I represent. Is I'm the nun that wants the monkey,
The
right?
nun with the
It
monkey.
doesn't make any sense to me. I want the monkey,
Yes, don't tell me I can't have a monkey. I'm getting one.
right? So I want to get into your favorite color and then
Mhm.
your one word, because we're almost at the hour. Like we're just flying by. We're just throwing out
Yeah.
history tonight, and I really love it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I love the questions that are coming in, and that a lot of them are. We've already given the answers because through our conversation, me and you, but a lot of them are like really into understanding that a lot of them have this misconception that the medievals was dark. So
Yeah.
when you're saying that it was lighter and they danced and they partied and they
Yeah.
passion, we're getting like a lot of people from Twitter that are just saying, "Wow, wow." We're getting a lot of wows. I don't know why the wow, but I believe if we don't give that information out and we don't show people the truth and speak the truth, how does anything change, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a
So
mission, isn't it?
right. So I
Yeah.
want to get into your favorite color. What is your
Yeah.
favorite color, girl?
My favorite color is green. I just love it. It's peaceful, and it actually really ties into the monk book. So I've loved green for quite a long time, and then as I was researching the monk book, it was the first thing that I talked about because the monks always they built their cloisters in a way that was kind of a square, and in the middle of the square they had something called a garth, and that was meant to be a green space, and it was meant to be there so that the monks could commune with nature, so that they could refresh themselves. And there's a lot of writing about how it refreshes your eyes after you've been working in the cloister all day. So while it wasn't super dark in there, there were windows and candles and stuff. Still, we know when we're on Zoom all day, we need a break. And there's
Yeah.
a real online trend right now saying touch grass, right? If you're online too much, go touch grass. And that's exactly what monks did. So that was kind of nice. When I wrote the book, we ended up doing a nice green theme in it because green is a refreshing color and it does make you feel better to look at a plant. It refreshes you. This is something that science has proved since the Middle Ages. So green is a nice vibe for me.
Well, us in Northern Ontario, there we have to dig under the snow for the grass to touch the
That's
grass right
right.
now. But I think
Yeah.
the grass is coming. I think the grass is going to come a little early this year,
Oh, I hope so.
right? So, and your one word to describe yourself.
Yeah, so the word I picked was compassionate, and that's not necessarily because I think that that is something that, I'm always living. I'm not a monk myself, right? I'm not a nun. But I try to be compassionate because it means being empathetic, right? Understanding other people where they're coming from. And that is always what I'm trying to do with my work is I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of people who lived a long time ago. And I'm trying to get other people to do this too. And part of it is because I want them to share my love and my joy of this time, this period, but I also want people to be in the practice of putting themselves in other people's shoes or feeling what they feel so that they can cross cultural lines and understand each other on the planet today, right? There we have so many more similarities than we have differences between us as people. And I think if we practice that empathy, that compassion, that real feeling for the people across the world, if we're in that practice all the time, then I think the world would be a better place. So I know that sounds like really starry, but that is really at the heart of my work is this empathy, this compassion. So it's the way I try to live. And it's it's what I bring to my work. So that's the word that I picked for you.
Well, and I love that word. We need more compassion.
Yeah.
It's a time of compassion.
Hmm.
So we have a couple minutes left before we're wrapping up. So any final words that you have for anyone out there, if they'd like to get into medieval? There's a place in I don't think it's Cobden. I know it's where the Big Apple is, and we're not talking New York. We're talking there's a Big Apple in Ontario that sells apple pies and stuff like that. And they have this big
Ah,
giant apple. um I can't even think of the town that it's in,
no,
but
no,
they
no.
have an medieval tournament where they have horses and that. Have you ever been to that?
I haven't been to that one. The last one I went to was the Robin in the Hood festival, and I think that's in Elmira. But it doesn't matter where the people listening are, there are usually medieval fairs everywhere. But when you go there, don't expect to see authenticity. Expect to see people playing. Expect to
Okay,
see pirates. Expect to see corsets. Expect to see fairies. These are not things that were happening in the Middle Ages. Not a Captain Sparrow type pirate. There were pirates, but they didn't look like that. So expect to see people playing in
okay,
history. If you want to find out more about actual history, what the facts were, I would say listen to my podcast because that's the whole point is to bring on experts who tell you just how it was. And I'm up to 186 episodes, I think, by next week. So there's a lot. And then you can find me on social media at 5MIN Medievalist. So the people who are on Twitter, like jump on over. I've got lots of stuff. I'm connected with lots of experts. You can find more stuff there. And hopefully you can read Life in Medieval Europe. That is so the sorry, Miss Liz has put up twitter.com/medievalist. That's not actually me. That's medievalist.net. So I'm
okay,
actually 5MIN Medievalist. But
okay.
what I was going to say is if you read my book, Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, which I think now is only available in ebook, I have to check with the publisher, but I think it's only ebook right now. I've actually generated that in the form of questions. So if you go to the table of contents, you find a question you want the answer to, and you can go and find it right away. So I wrote that one so you could read it start to finish, or you could just jump in and take the things you want out of it. And hopefully it's written in a way that speaks to you, that's friendly, and will give you the facts. And then of course at the back I have further reading so that I'm your gateway. You can find even more expert people talking about each of these subjects.
So if anybody wanted to find you, Danielle, it's this site, right? The
Uh,
.net one, so they can
no,
find your podcast and all of that stuff on there, or no?
it's on my website, which I'm gonna put in our private chat
Okay,
right
and then
now,
I'll
Miss
pop it
Liz,
up.
and then I'll put in um where my social media, and I'm on Twitter. I'm rarely on Facebook, but I have a presence on Facebook and Instagram, a little bit on TikTok, not much, and I have a few videos on YouTube as well. So can you find that, Miss Liz? You see it?
Yes, I do, and I'm going to pop that up right now so we can see it.
There we go. So that's my website. You can find everything I've done there. I've got a couple of ebooks that you can buy direct from the website that are just little. And then you can find the actual books. All my books on Amazon, Waterstones, Indigo, Barnes and Noble, all over the place. And the audiobook, if you're into audio, is narrated by me for How to Live Like a Monk. So you can just like overindulge on my voice if you like. Although it sounds better than this because, like I said, I am dying of this cold right now. I'm doing my best here.
Well, you sound really good for a cold.
Oh,
Like,
thanks. It's the tea.
right? Drink your tea.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what we need to do is drink our tea. Uh, I really want to thank you, Danielle, for joining me tonight on Tea Time and bringing all of this history and this education and facts, and checking it out. And I have your Twitter up as well now, so check her out, connect with her, and check out her podcast.
Mhm.
Check out the incredible books because I think that we need more history. I love history because I'm always questioning everything I watch. I'm just like, is that true? Or is that fantasy? Or is that friction? Is that exaggerating? So there's a lot of things that I question a lot. So again, thank you, Danielle, for joining me on Tea Time tonight. It was an honor to have you here. And be sure to check out Danielle, and her full bio is on Miss Liz's Facebook page. I will see everybody next Thursday with 3 more tea times. And we will be having different countries in again. So we have UK, and I think we have 2 United States next week. Or we might have a Canadian one. I'm not sure. But I know we have a UK for sure. So check that one out. And again, we're going to be here from 10, 3, and 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every Thursday. If there's a tea time not on a Thursday, it's because it's a rescheduled tea time that was missed in January. Those guests will be popping back in because Mrs. has contacted all of them and they are all rescheduled. So everyone is coming to tea time. So again, thank you and have a good night. And I will see everybody on Thursday next week. Danielle, don't leave. I will wrap up with you in the back.